Well, thanks for coming, everybody. My name's Will Roush. I'm the Conservation Director at the Wilderness Workshop. As folks probably know, this is our Naturalist Night series. We partner with the Aspen Center for Environmental Studies in Roaring Fork, Audubon, and bring a series of experts on ecological and environmental science and policy issues to the Valley throughout the winter. I think it's been a great season. We've had kind of record turnout, so thanks everybody for showing up. Tonight we're hearing from Peter, but I'll just say a couple words before that. So as I mentioned, it's a collaboration between the three groups. You can catch the presentations down here every Wednesday night at 5:30, and then Thursday nights up in Aspen at Hallam Lake, where ACES is on Thursdays at 7 o'clock. And you'll notice a camera and a bright light in the back of the room. We film all of the talks using Grassroots TV, and the way we're able to do that is through a set of sponsors that help pay for that, and then also provide lodging and sometimes a free ski lift for our presenters, which allows us to get folks down here. And tonight, I just want to recognize especially the tea company, Two Leaves in a Bud. They provide tea for everybody to drink. So before I introduce Peter, I'll just let folks know that our next talk is actually not a talk, it's a film, Damnation, which is about kind of dam removal across the U.S. Patagonia was one of the producers of it, and it's a pretty impressive environmental film that has a bunch of great historical footage, but also really kind of paints a picture of why dams can be pretty problematic and what folks are doing to remove them. So tonight we're hearing from Peter. Peter's the director of the Northern Rockies office of the Wilderness Society. I think he's been working there for a decade or so. Part of the reason we're excited to have Peter down here is because in his work up in Montana, Wyoming, he was pretty integral in the efforts there to protect almost 2 million acres of national forest land from oil and gas development. And it's a pretty similar situation to what we're facing just out the window here on the Thompson Divide. So Peter's going to kind of tell us stories from the north, but with an eye towards what we might learn from that. And of course, feel free to ask questions afterwards, and both Peter and I can answer any of those questions about kind of how what's going on up there relates to what's happening here. So thanks very much for coming out, Peter.
Thank you. And I guess I don't need that, right? The microphone? And I'll put a plug in too. I've seen the film Damnation. It's definitely worth seeing. It's a really well done film.
What will that
that would be Will's answer.
That'll be next Wednesday here at 5:30, same time, same place, or up in Aspen at 7 on Thursday.
All right. Well, it's great to be here. I think sometimes we don't, in a conservation movement, celebrate our victories enough or talk about them enough. So I'm happy to be able to have some victories to share and maybe talk about some lessons learned from them. But also there is a bit of where the fight goes on. It's not a complete end of the story on some of these. So just real quickly first, since Will said I work for the Wilderness Society. If you're not familiar, the Wilderness Society was founded in 1935. It's a national conservation group. Its mission is to protect wilderness and inspire Americans to care about our shared public wildlands. And we're headquartered in Washington, D.C. We do a lot on national policy and legislation, but also do work out in the West, mostly where our public lands are, related to building coalitions, running kind of campaigns, have a science and research arm, grassroots things. So we have a regional office here in Denver, and like Will said, I'm from the regional office in the Northern Rockies, so I'm actually living in Bozeman, Montana. So just a quick outline of what I'm going to cover and go through, and then we can hopefully have some questions and discussions at the end. First, I just wanted to orient you visually in terms of the Northern Rockies and some of the oil and gas campaign places I'm going to talk about, where they are on a map. And in the Montana ones, I'm going to basically talk about two areas, the Rocky Mountain Front and the Badger 2 Medicine, which is really one area, as I'll show on a map, and then the North Fork of the Flathead watershed. Then we'll move down to Wyoming and talk about the Wyoming Range, and a specific drilling project to the north end of the Wyoming Range in the upper Hoback, and then we'll kind of end with some lessons learned. So that's just a quick overview. So just to orient you, here we have the three-state Northern Rockies. So the colors on this map, so maybe just to orient you, the brown, this is Yellowstone National Park and Grand Teton. Here's Glacier National Park. The dark green are wilderness areas. This is the Bob Marshall Wilderness. This is all the Central Idaho Wilderness Complex, the wilderness areas around Yellowstone. The yellow is Forest Service roadless areas. Purple are Native American reservations. Brown is BLM lands. So again, we're going to talk first about, we'll start from the north and go south, I guess you say. We're going to talk about some lessons or some campaigns up in this part of Montana around the Rocky Mountain front here and the North Fork of the Flathead over here next on the west side of Glacier. Then we'll move down to Wyoming and the southern end of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem and the Wyoming Range, which is right in this area here. So just a kind of a blow up to kind of show it better. Again, this is just a blow up, same color scheme from that previous map with Glacier National Park, the Canadian border, US-Canadian border here at the top, and the big Bob Marshall Wilderness. The Rocky Mountain front, which I'll be talking about, is this area that runs along the eastern edge. And this little chunk in here, surrounded between Bob Marshall Wilderness, Glacier National Park, and the Blackfeet Reservation, is what's called the Badger 2 Medicine area. The North Fork of the Flathead, again, is this area over here. And then in Wyoming, just to blow up, that Wyoming Range kind of runs from just south of Jackson Hole, kind of this long mountain range here that's kind of between the Wind River Range over here and with this big valley, open area in between is called the Upper Green River Valley. All right, so let's start again with the Rocky Mountain front. So this is just a quick kind of bulleted the developments that I'm going to run through. So we had legislation passed in 2006, which withdrew about 500,000 acres of national forest and BLM lands from any future leasing for oil and gas. Similar, I think, in some ways to the proposed legislation introduced by Senator Bennett last Congress for the Thompson Divide. Then after that, we had, again, that was about future leasing. So we had some valid existing leases that were still there, and as I'll talk about. And so we had a period for about 2 years where we had some of those leases either bought out, several million dollars spent to buy out the leases, or some that were voluntarily donated back. And then once they were either bought out or donated back, they were handed back to the Forest Service, to the government. And because the legislation had been passed, you had the kind of certainty that the government couldn't ever turn around and re-offer them for lease, unless you, of course, went back and changed the withdrawal bill. And then most recently, since it's the same geography, I'll make mention of it, we actually had passed, just in December, a piece of legislation called the Rocky Mountain Front Heritage Act, which designated new wilderness and a new conservation management area for the same landscape. And actually, it was the first new wilderness in Montana in 31 years. And unfortunately, though, like I was saying in the beginning, we still have issues, oil and gas issues playing out in this area, mostly or entirely in this Badger 2 Medicine area, that chunk up in the north, which I'll talk about at the end. So here's the Rocky Mountain front. It's a spectacular place. It's basically where the plains and the prairie slams up against the Rocky Mountains. It's in some ways similar, I guess you could say, to your Front Range in Colorado, except with take all the development and cities and most of the roads away. It's incredibly valuable wildlife habitat, lots of ecological diversity because of, again, in a very short space of time, going from cactus literally and prairie up to alpine. So just another photo of what it looks like. Not a lot of long foothills. It basically just is, again, smashing of prairie into the mountains, up thrust. So again, just to orient you again, this is the Rocky Mountain front. This is that Badger 2 Medicine piece at the north. So the lighter green, the color is a little different. The dark green is designated wilderness. This lighter green is just regular Forest Service land. So again, it's almost, this is now overlaid what's roadless. Again, it's almost 95% of it was roadless, meaning it qualifies to become wilderness, has no system roads under the Forest Service's definition on it, so it's really wild country. But it had oil and gas leases, so that's those purple that I just overlaid. These are valid leases. Most of them were in this Badger 2 Medicine area. About 2/3 of it was under valid lease. Most of them were actually offered for lease by Secretary James Watt in the mid-'80s under Ronald Reagan's administration when he was Secretary of the Interior. And there was just this one area that was under lease in this part of the front called the Blackleaf area. And this little square that's kind of outlined was where a company back in 2002 came forward with drilling permits. They wanted to basically drill for natural gas and build a bunch of roads and compressor stations and all the rest of it in this area, which set off a whole environmental impact statement process to review that proposal. That threat, and this is actually looking at where it was, basically it was on the flanks of Choteau Mountain. So right up in here was the proposed drill site in this area, and the road was going to snake up over here and kind of come into a plateau right up in here. That's kind of all the Rocky Mountain front, obviously, in that area. What this did, this proposal, is it galvanized a bunch of very diverse, strange bedfellows. You've probably heard that term, of local ranchers, outfitters, sportsmen, hunting and fishing interests, the Blackfeet tribe, business owners, a variety of conservation and sportsman groups and others. And they came together and formed something called the Coalition to Protect the Rocky Mountain Front. And they basically were, well, the catalyst again was that drilling proposal in the Blackleaf area of the front. And they worked hard engaging in the EIS process and raising public awareness and talking a lot of it was about maintaining the traditional recreation uses of that area of the front and the economic values of very sustainable uses like outfitting, hunting, fishing, and how those could be negatively impacted if we brought oil and gas to the front. This was a billboard that was ran in several places. We kind of used this is actually, the front actually continues north across the border into Alberta, and there they've had quite extensive oil and gas development. So this is actually a picture of their front with a huge processing plant for all their oil and gas. This is actually, if it was in color, this is all actually big sulfur piles because it's very the gas up there is very high in that, so they had to remove it all. And so this was, making the message, hopefully it's clear, about, one-time quick buck versus the long-term, longer, more meaningful relationship, I guess, with your landscape. So what happened was, as I put in that outline, is we ended up getting a piece of legislation introduced, first actually introduced by our Republican senator at the time, to do a withdrawal of the area. And withdrawal legislation that's been done in various places are all pretty much the same, where they say this area is special and this is not an appropriate place for oil and gas development, so we are removing the area from future, usually it's hard rock mining and oil and gas leasing. But again, it doesn't deal with any they grandfather in any valid existing rights that were there before the legislation passes, and that was the case here. So first introduced by our Republican senator, then picked up by our Democratic senator, Senator Baucus, and it was eventually passed by Congress in December of 2006. And this purple basically is the area of the withdrawal, so it basically took in everything and withdrew it from any future leasing. At the same time that was going on, there were negotiations going on with this company that was a Canadian company that, again, had applied for drilling permits. And the negotiations had gotten to a place where a conservation buyer had agreed to, again, a several $million deal to basically buy out their leases. But the deal was premised on only if the legislation passes, because the conservation buyer did not want to buy, they don't really want to buy the lease and sit on it and hold it. They want to be able to buy it and hand it back to the government. And unless they have the legislation passed to ensure the government wouldn't, remember this is in 2006, this is the middle of the Bush administration, things were fairly pro-oil and gas. So they wanted this legislation passed to have that kind of certainty. So as soon as the legislation passed, that deal was consummated and all those leases basically went away and that whole drilling threat went away. Then over the next 2 years, there were several deals that were done for these leases up in the Badger 2 Medicine area. So the first ones were done were these green ones. Most of these were actually donated. And then a second set of deals with, you can see the companies listed, Oxy Petroleum and Williams, where they basically just wanted to be seen as good corporate citizens in terms of recognizing that there was a lot of opposition right next to Glacier National Park. And so they did big press conference with Senator Baucus and such and basically just handed the leases back. However, so that's all great. So we got rid of most of the leases in the Badger 2 Medicine, but not these brown ones, which remain. And there's actually, this is actually a little bit inaccurate. Part of the brown is this kind of slice up at the very top there. So then next in time, so that again was about 2006, 2008, was that same coalition that came together around this oil and gas issue continued on and said, you know, we should actually be proactive. Instead of just focusing on waiting to the next threat that comes, we want to keep the front the way it is. That was the kind of mantra that was used by that diverse coalition. They decided, let's develop a proactive piece of proposal for legislation that would, you know, basically keep the front the way it is. And what was developed was the Rocky Mountain Front Heritage Act, which had 3 pieces to it. New wilderness, 67,000 acres of new wilderness, which is this kind of teal green. There are basically additions to the Bob Marshall. Then all the rest of the Forest Service and BLM lands on the front would basically be put into a new designated area called a Conservation Management Area, 208,000 acres. That basically said no road building by law. Motorized use can be allowed where it's existing at the time, but can never be expanded. Some people have kind of termed this conservation management area wilderness light. In some ways it is. You can use chainsaws in it. You can ride your mountain bike in it. And then the third part was a provision about noxious weed program on the front, which is a big deal. So, like I said, this was introduced by Senator Baucus and kind of went through 2 different sessions of Congress, and we thought we were going to be starting all over again with this session of Congress, but it actually came together in what's called the lame duck session of Congress this last November, December, and got packaged with a bunch of other bills and passed as part of the Defense Reauthorization Act. So it was a big deal, lots of great celebrations in Montana. This was very popular across the state, this proposal. Like I said, the first wilderness in 31 years. So, all great stuff. However, it goes on. Those leases out in the Badger 2 Medicine, these brown ones, this is the same slide as before, and again, one up in here. This area, which is actually still, again, was brown on that other map. There is these leases, I should back up. These leases that are brown have been suspended, which is a BLM process. The BLM still manages the minerals even when it's under Forest Service lands. Suspended is a process where basically the clock on the lease is just frozen and stuck while for a variety of reasons. In this case, all these leases were suspended starting in the early 90s under Secretary Bruce Babbitt because the tribe who values this area as part of their traditional area and very sacred had petitioned to have the whole area designated what's called a traditional cultural district under the National Historic Preservation Act. And while that kind of review process was going on, they suspended the leases. And that process dragged on, and they had other reasons also, and they kept the suspensions going to this day. However, this leaseholder, who has actually also a suspended drilling permit for right here, brought a lawsuit a year and a half ago with the Mountain States Legal Fund to basically against the federal government, saying that he had been, basically the suspensions were impacting his legal right with a valid lease. And so now there is a big new effort going on and a whole new campaign to basically engage about how to stop this drilling proposal here and see if we can negotiate a buyout of his lease. But he doesn't seem very open and willing on that. So there's a whole other chapter still to come dealing with stopping drilling, even though we've passed the legislation and had a number of lease buyouts and tradeouts. So that's the Rocky Mountain front. And we kind of, just again, what we covered, the withdrawal legislation passing, those buyouts, retirements, the passage of the Heritage Act, which really isn't about oil and gas, it's about wilderness and other things, and then the Badger 2 Medicine issue. So moving over to the North Fork of the Flathead, this is, again, on the west side of Glacier National Park, a beautiful valley. So this is in Glacier, kind of the quintessential view with the mountain goat. Incredibly, it's a wild and scenic river, the North Fork of the Flathead. It was designated in 74, 76. Incredibly pure water, bull trout, West Slope cutthroat trout. It's got the highest density of grizzly bears, the transboundary Flathead, in North America outside of the coastal zone. And it is quickly what happened there is, so the actual North Fork of the Flathead actually starts up in British Columbia and then flows across the border into Montana, down next to Glacier on that map, and eventually into Flathead Lake. Up in the British Columbia side of the watershed, there had been very active drilling proposals and coal mining proposals in the watershed, and a huge, going on for over 10 years, campaign to try to stop that and deal with it. Well, during the Winter Olympics that were in Vancouver in 2010, the Premier of British Columbia, after getting a lot of pressure, decided that the Olympics was the place to basically green his credentials, and so made a big public pronouncement about British Columbia would cancel their leases and withdraw their side of the watershed up in Canada if the United States would take similar action on the US side. And he basically had a big press conference with the governor of Montana and a big signing ceremony and all of this. So that happened in the winter of 2010. So then connected with that, what we saw was, here's just the US, so here again, the US-Canadian border. So the watershed, it's hard to see, it basically runs up here off the map is the watershed, and it runs this way, obviously, down here and then into Flathead Lake over here. Kalispell and Whitefish are right here if you know that area. So this is the watershed, basically. Again, you can see a big chunk of it's on the British Columbia side. So they had withdrawn and canceled the pending coal mine and oil and gas issues on the Canadian, so the British Columbia side, had passed legislation in the BC Parliament to withdraw this area, and so then it became the United States' turn to do their part of the deal for the US side of the watershed. We had lots of leases on the US. This is all these checkerboard or active leases on the US side of the watershed. They were active leases, but they were never fully valid. There was some kind of legal problems with the original reviews that were done when these leases were issued. And there never really had been serious oil and gas company proposals to develop on this side. The geology actually isn't really very conducive. And so several of the companies realized, now there's a lot of pressure and a spotlight on us, given all those pronouncements that I described. And so what happened next was first a whole bunch of, I should back up, a bunch of these leaseholders basically, again, voluntarily donated their leases back to the federal government. At the same time that, again, Senator Baucus introduced legislation very similar to the Rocky Mountain Front one to do a withdrawal for, again, the US side. In this case, they actually did their voluntary donations of leases back before the legislation had passed or gone anywhere in Congress. So that helped kind of create the momentum, and it made the withdrawal legislation politically very safe. I mean, because you already had the oil and gas companies who had active leases there saying, look, we're giving up our, ConocoPhillips being the big one, we're giving up all of our leases here. This is not the appropriate place for drilling. So we had everyone from chambers of commerce to, everyone possible was on board with this withdrawal legislation. So you would think that would make it easy to pass, but not in our Congress. There was hardly any opposition, but it still took 3 sessions of Congress before that bill passed. It also just passed as part of that same package in December. It's called the North Fork of the Flathead Watershed Protection Act, and it's basically a withdrawal from oil and gas and hard rock mining of this area. And so that's now been passed, and again, most all of the leases were donated even before it obviously passed. So really that is kind of a victory, and we're kind of end of story in terms of oil and gas on the North Fork of the Flathead. So now moving down to Wyoming, kind of the last one, and then we'll close with some lessons learned. Again, that Wyoming Range, again, just to go through the kind of steps of what happened. Somewhat similar to the Rocky Mountain Front, there was initial proposed leasing in the mid-2000s, 2005, 2006, which kind of brought together a diversity of strange bedfellows into a coalition and challenging that leasing, which then led to, again, withdrawal legislation, which is called the Wyoming Range Legacy Act, which passed Congress in 2009. But then there were some valid leases that again were grandfathered in with drilling proposals and again environmental impact statement on it. That was a whole nother campaign that played out for 4 years until there was a big private buyout of that, which I'll talk about. But again, kind of like the Montana one, there's still a final chapter that we're still engaged with that I'll kind of talk about at the end there. So to understand what happened in the Wyoming Range, because most people you think of Wyoming, it's like the most pro-oil and gas place you can imagine, right? And there's a lot of oil and gas in Wyoming. So this is from the Upper Green River Valley. This is on BLM lands, lands owned by all of us, federal government lands. Really, dense drilling. This is in the Jonah Field. And so what had happened is you had very extensive drilling happening in the Upper Green River Valley starting in about 1998, 2000, and it just took off. This is showing that these are leases in the Upper Green River Valley. Obviously, green is national forest lands. The BLM, it's hard to see, the yellow is, most of this in the valley is all BLM. There is some private. And these are all the leases. That Jonah Field picture is from this area. There's another big gas field here called the Pinedale Anticline. There's another one here called the Big Piney LaBarge Field. Something like 10,000 wells in that valley. So people in Pinedale, on the one hand, enjoyed huge wealth that came from all this development. On the other hand, it's a spectacular area with really high wildlife and other values. Has like amazing big game migrations. Most famous is this pronghorn migration called the Path of the Pronghorn, which actually goes from Grand Teton National Park like 200 miles down through the Upper Green River Valley every fall and spring, north-south. And there's the Wind Rivers wilderness area in the background there with a new drill rig going in the Upper Green River Valley. So what we were finding is that people there, while they supported oil and gas in certain places and were benefiting from it, they'd kind of reached a point where they were like, enough is enough. In fact, that was their slogan that they kept using, was enough is enough. And they really mentally, or in terms of their views, they really drew a distinction between drilling down in the valley, which was mostly BLM lands, and the idea of any drilling up in the national forests, up in the mountains. There were people literally that worked on rigs, and they would say, I work 10 days on, 4 days off, and on my 4 days off, I go up on my ATV and go hunting and fishing up in the Wyoming Range, and I don't want to see a drill rig up here. So this is interesting. This was from polling that was done by the Bridger-Teton National Forest for their forest plan, where they asked about drilling on national forest lands. These are the questions they asked. And then, here's the overall results kind of over a 5-county area. But if you go to the ones that are in red at the end here, so Teton County is Jackson Hole. It's the most liberal, people joke it's like the only place in Wyoming that's not Wyoming. It's very, Sublette County is Pinedale. It is the most conservative Republican county in the state. It's most of that Upper Green River Valley. And when you look at some of the results, you'll see that in some ways, Sublette County was even more opposed to drilling in the forest than Teton County. And certainly the two of them were way more opposed than the rest of these counties who don't have much oil and gas and were just more not living it, if you will. So there was really no appetite for seeing leasing or drilling even in conservative Sublette County because they had lots of it. Again, that enough is enough in the Upper Green River Valley. So again, the Forest Service in 2005 came forward with this proposal to issue new leases in the Wyoming Range. This is actually one of the lease areas they were proposing. Wyoming Range is a spectacular area. This is the Wyoming Range in the background. And it created, again, quite a backlash, quite a stir. And so all sorts of people came together, and there was all sorts of organizing that went on to basically try to stop this. And there was a group, there were various groups formed. One was called Citizens for the Wyoming Range. It was made up of outfitters who outfitted in the Wyoming Range, sportsmen, homeowners, ranchers, conservationists. There was Sportsmen for the Wyoming Range, a whole other group. There was a third group formed. There was, other organizations like mine and others that were engaged. And they basically, and the Forest Service didn't back off, and they went ahead and offered these 44,000 acres over 4 different lease sales. They were legally challenged by a whole host of, including the governor of Wyoming, challenged them. He was a Democrat. That was a Democratic governor at the time, Friedenthal. And what happened is that the leases were issued. Half of them were issued and then suspended because we ultimately did win the lawsuit that there was insufficient analysis, environmental analysis, to support the leasing decision. And the other half were not even issued. They were just basically offered. But for the half that were offered and then issued, they collected millions of dollars from the high bidders for those lease sales, and that money is still sitting in escrow as those leases sit still today in limbo, which I'll talk about at the end. So this is one of the ones that was issued. This was actually an area, if you can believe, that they wanted to offer for lease up in here in South Cottonwood Creek. Yeah, this is one of the ones that was issued and then suspended because once we won the lawsuit, they were the leases were put on hold. So again, what that led to, this diverse group is saying, we got to do something, and they came up with a withdrawal proposal. Again, federal legislation to withdraw the area from any future oil and gas leasing or hard rock mining. This one was big, 1.2 million acres. So basically, it's hard to see in this, but it's basically took in the entire boundary pretty much. And it comes up, you can see basically like that. So the whole area is 1.2 million acres. These color-coded ones, which are kind of confusing on this map, so there's 3 categories of leases on national forest lands. So that's the withdrawal boundary. There's 3 categories of leases. There are this color, I don't know what I want to call that, are valid leases. Here, these. Then we have these ones, which are the ones, let's see if I got this right, that were pending. So they were never issued. They were offered, then stopped. Then there were this color, which are the ones that were issued and then suspended. So that legislation, again, was introduced by the 2 Republican senators, very pro-oil and gas of Wyoming, Senator Enzi and Senator Barrasso. Barrasso was the lead. It was one of his first bills when he became senator. And it moved through and was passed in 2009, which was big for Wyoming because, again, it's such an oil and gas state. To take that big of an area and withdraw it permanently from oil and gas leasing is pretty exceptional. But like I said, that deals with future leasing, and you had these valid existing leases, and there was this one area of valid existing leases where a pretty major sized company from Texas, Plains Exploration and Production Company, had a proposal to drill in the upper Hoback, which is at the north end of the Wyoming Range. So here, just to orient you. So here's Jackson Hole. Well, here's Jackson, the town, if you know the area at all, Grand Teton National Park. Hoback Junction, and this is the highway that comes down to go into the Upper Green. And here's the Hoback River. The Wyoming Range kind of starts right here and runs south. The Hoback River kind of runs like this into the Snake River. And this was the proposed drilling site that Plains Exploration and Production Company had. So there was an EIS process they wanted to drill 21 well pads, put in 18 miles of new road, compressor station, worker camp, all the infrastructure. This is the area that it was proposed for. This is kind of from an airplane looking kind of north. So you can kind of see the Tetons out here and Jackson's down here. This is the proposed area and the kind of a blow-up. These were the well pad areas and the roads that they wanted to build in. So again, the same coalition that came together engaged for many, many years in that environmental impact statement process around their drilling permits, and basically tried to drag it out and make it as expensive as possible for them. They had a legal right. This was a valid legal lease. There was no way just to take away their lease right. But you can impose through the Forest Service, as the land manager can impose, and the BLM, mitigation measures, requirements on them for how it goes forward. And so the coalition used that process to basically, like I said, try to add as many mitigation measures and make it as expensive and dragged out as possible. That worked because at the same time the price of natural gas was going way down, and there was way less interest in developing in more speculative areas like this and throwing lots of money, not just into developing it, probably into litigation, challenging it once the EIS was done. And so a negotiation took place where the company in the end kind of relented and agreed to sell out their leases for $8.5 million. But the trick was, they said, this is one of the paid ads. So the company was based out of Houston. I guess you have to know that to understand the ads. This was in the Jackson paper. Houston, we have a problem, and it was about, the proposed site. So the company basically said, we will sell our lease to the Trust for Public Lands, who had done the negotiation, for $8.5 million. But that basically got settled or negotiated out in basically midsummer, around August 1st. But they basically said, we need to have all that money by the end of the year. So we basically had to raise $8.5 million in about 5 months. So it was a very interesting campaign of fundraising, if you will, it was all private dollars with a little bit of state of Wyoming money, actually, from a mitigation fund that the state has. But it was the two largest donors to it, to give you a sense, there was one who put in about $2 million and another one who put in almost $1 million. But then from that, all the rest was like, there were people literally writing $25 checks, like thousands of people who wrote $25 checks. And then there was a level of people who wrote, a couple $1,000 checks. And it was a really grassroots, and it barely got there. We got the money raised just around Christmas to basically consummate the deal and buy out all of, it was about 60,000 acres. So it was all of these blue, this is the Upper Hoback up in here. So it was all these leases that were owned by PXP, that's Plains Exploration and Production Company. So all these blue ones basically were bought out and again handed back to the government, and that whole drilling threat was stopped permanently. Again, the last thing is that we're still dealing with these, what we call contested leases. These were the ones that started the whole campaign, and we won the lawsuit, but that, they're now having to do the BLM and the Forest Service, a new environmental impact statement to basically review whether they can lease them or not. And that's been dragging on and going on since literally about almost 2007, 2008, that new EIS process. So that's just to end now with some lessons learned. I'll just talk about a couple things. As you've probably gotten the sense, this is a marathon, not a sprint. You definitely have to take the long view. These things can play out over a decade plus, and with some of them, like I said, even when you think you've had these victories, there's still another chapter to come. But if you build a strong kind of coalition and have some victories, that hopefully sustains you, and you take the long view, I think time is on our side in some of these. This gives a good example of that. This was produced by Trout Unlimited, who was involved in the Wyoming Range. This is it's obviously they produced it 2 years ago, so we need to update it to 2015. But this is when it all started was 2005. The Forest Service proposes leasing. The Sportsmen for the Wyoming Range founded. We win in court, so the leasing gets paused. Then we get the Wyoming Range Legacy Act introduced into Congress. Then we get it passed. We come to 2011. The agency actually originally issued a decision that was good on the contested leases. But when they got all this blowback from industry, then they said, oh, wait, we got to retract that. We're going to have to do a new supplemental EIS. So it kind of like, ugh. And then we get down here, and here's the PXP leases are all bought out, and we're still waiting for, that's why we call it full circle, the thing that originally started it to actually be done, which is to have that final leasing EIS completed with a decision that says, no, this is not an appropriate area to lease. So again, taking the long view. Second lesson learned is leveraging nearby development and nearby issues. So whether that was what I talked about in the North Fork of the Flathead, where you had the British Columbia government kind of taking the first lead and then kind of putting the onus on the US and the state of Montana to say, now you got to do your part of the watershed, or whether it's like from the Upper Green, where it's like how to make sure all that development on BLM lands in the Upper Green River Valley could be utilized, marshaled to kind of build a strong coalition against any leasing or drilling on the nearby national forest. So there's definitely things to be leveraged, and also leveraging like some of the withdrawal legislation we used from the Rocky Mountain Front. We kind of used that as the template for how to write it and show that it could be done for the North Fork and then likewise for the Wyoming Range. So there's that kind of leveraging. Again, this is just a shot from the upper green, making that case from, is this what we want in our national forests? Some of the air quality or wildlife or, signs like this, entering a toxic gas production field. Another one is, of course, building effective grassroots coalitions and grass tops kind of organizing. We had groups formed, like I said, they were very diverse, and I know that's also the case here with the Thompson Divide Coalition of, people from all different, may not agree on everything, but we can agree on this one issue, and let's work together on this one issue that we can agree on. This was a great billboard that ran in the Wyoming, the Sportsman for the Wyoming Range ran in Wyoming. Very Wyoming message, right? Another one is about the importance of legal research and engagement. These things are complicated, policy and legal-wise, when you start getting into lease rights and, how well the analysis was done to support certain decisions. And so you need to have, if you don't have them directly involved, you need to go find them in terms of some really smart kind of legal minds and policy people to help you with that kind of part of it, I think. Again, I just throw this up kind of showing how we did some of the analysis around the leases and the status of them and all that for the Wyoming Range. And then bipartisan support. All of three of these ones that I've talked about, and I know that's probably true here too with the Thompson Divide, were not, they had both parties involved. In some cases they were actually, like I said, almost entirely Republican-led, like the Wyoming Range one. The governor was Democrat, but the whole delegation is Republican. Others, like the Rocky Mountain Front, in the North Fork, were kind of shared in leadership, I guess you could say, between a Republican and a Democratic member of the delegation. Our Congressman Daines, now our senator, was the one who led the North Fork of the withdrawal bill in the House of Representatives and actually got it passed last Congress. It's kind of amazing. If you think of the House of Representatives, they don't pass a lot of conservation measures. And he passed this as standalone legislation 2 years ago in the House, just showing, and you can see some of the diversity. I mean, this is like a wise use group. This is, here we have ConocoPhillips, the Raft Company, Trout Unlimited, obviously, and Northern National Parks Conservation, the Wilderness Society, and all that. And then kind of the last lesson, of course, is the power of the landscape and leading with the values around the landscape. I mean, that's the one thing that with some of these areas that we have on our side. I mean, you can really connect emotionally with people, and people's uses of the area is something that they will really fight for. And getting people who don't know that out there. This was a tour we did in the Wyoming Range with the governor's staffer, with some of the ranchers and outfitters who were engaged, doing overflights, like here's from an overflight on the Rocky Mountain Front, and just kind of showing off the landscape and its values. And from here's the North Fork of the Flathead, beautiful areas. So I'll end with that, and happy to take any questions. So thanks.
So we can get them recorded.
I guess I'll call on you, but you got to wait for the microphone, I think.
Yeah, I'm sending out my appreciation to all of you for doing such an amazing job of perseverance and protection. It just takes a long time to do that, and we're involved in a similar struggle here. I also find that it's very curious that the people have to buy back their property to protect it environmentally and economically from a dirty industry. And my one question is, when you're involved in doing this, here in Garfield County we have 100 short of 11,000 wells. The Garfield County commissioners are always talking about takings. And that's a big piece of what seems to drive some people's belief in that it's okay to do some of this stuff in places because somebody's property is being taken. The original takings is from the people and the lands And did that come up?
Yeah, it's a good question, and another way of saying, I think what you're getting at is that, boy, maybe a lesson out of all this is people should really understand how big a decision it is when we decide to offer an area for lease of public lands. Because, boy, once, like I said, some of these leases were originally, the decision and issuing of them were in the Badger 2 Medicine under James Watt, and we're still fighting over them today. It's like, I don't know how old I was then, but it's like, this is 1984. It was like, I don't think I was just starting high school, right? It's like, and so to think like we should just make really clear when we're making leasing decisions that we have done a really good job of analyzing the impacts and deciding if that's the right lease to be issuing or place to be issuing a lease. I'm not going to say that there's, no place for oil and gas development on our public lands. I think there is. I think we need to be really careful about where it's done, and I think there's also, of course, stipulations you can add to the lease. But to go to your question in terms of did that takings argument come up, yeah, it did a little bit. And that's where people felt fine when it's like, oh, so the way it would come up, which is also in some ways frustrating, is it would say, okay, well, those companies, quote, operated in good faith. The federal government decided to lease this area. There's a competitive, auction. They were the high bidders. They paid their money. They went through all the steps to keep the lease valid. We can't now, it's kind of a core value from a business sense that we have to respect that legal right. And so if we're going to come in and not let them develop, they need to be justly compensated, right? The trick on that was, well, okay, so is justly compensated just paying them back the amount of money that they had spent to acquire the lease and keep it valid? Or is it also to pay them some dollar figure that's based on the projected amount of oil and gas resource they are giving up and future profit they might be making? And that came up a fair bit. And I think what happened was, whether you go to the federal government or whoever, there is no kind of simple formula that says, oh, when you go buy out a lease, you just take this number times that, and that's how much the gas is worth, and you just write a check for that. It is completely up for negotiation. And there's like infinite number of variables that can come into that negotiation. And in some ways, oil and gas companies do this all the time. They buy out each other's leases all the time, and so they know how to do that, and they know that there's no kind of simple formula. So, that's why in some ways with that Plains exploration and production proposal at the north end of in the Hoback, in the north end of the Wyoming Range, in some ways it was great that we engaged for all those years in that environmental impact statement process and kept getting these mitigation measures added and kept getting delay, because it made us in a much stronger bargaining position in those negotiations to say, look at all these requirements you're going to have and how much you're going to have to spend. You're going to say whatever you're going to say in terms of how great the resource you think is there, but look at what you're going to have to spend. And so that ended up they didn't start at, let me put it this way, they did not start at $8.5 million. They started at like $40 million in the negotiation in terms of what they thought they should be compensated. So I don't know if I'm directly answering your question, but yeah. And the other frustrating thing I will say is that a core kind of Republican value, especially for the Wyoming delegation and such, was like, and even for county commissioners and others, is like, all right, if you're going to buy out leases, we're okay with that, but not a single cent of federal taxpayer dollars should be spent. Even though it was, I won't get into the arguments, but they just didn't want to have this be anything that was utilizing the federal government and federal dollars. So they were much more comfortable if it was privately raised dollars, which is, not always the easiest, but. Thank you. Yep.
At all levels of governance, people are figuring out that you have to follow a public process that's open, transparent, engages the public. I bet 99% of most people have no idea that the government is leasing lands for, and regardless of which side of the oil and gas divide you're on, it's a flawed process. I would say we need to start there instead of after leases are are given
Yeah.
to engage the public. The public needs to be engaged. Can you comment on how we can do that?
Yeah, no, couldn't agree more. You know, well, one thing, depending on the area you're interested in, is obviously to join and be part of whatever conservation group that is kind of watchdogging, and in this case, probably Wilderness Watch and groups like that are certainly not going to let a lease sale come up and not alert the public and engage the public on it, right? For their geography, whatever their geography is that group is involved in. The other thing, though, I would say is that it has gotten better. Like, it was terrible, I would argue, during the first term of the Bush administration. They had a big push to basically dramatically increase leasing on public lands, and it created a whole kind of backlash of a lot of the public was caught unaware, like you're suggesting, but people would be filing lots of lawsuits and challenges, but not always winning them, right? One of the things that's gotten much better is under, I guess it was started in the first term of the Obama administration, is they came in with a whole package of leasing reforms. And a lot of these reforms were about how to make it a much more transparent process, how to have it, they created something into these leasing reforms called master leasing plans, which was something where they basically made an argument or set up a process where they said, we should actually, instead of just having these willy-nilly kind of leasing decisions, we should take a watershed or a geography or some kind of defined area and make a more kind of proactive choice and decision about both what areas are appropriate to lease in it with whatever stipulations and what areas we're going to basically say are going to be put aside and will not be leased. And so this is, and what part of the argument that was made by doing these master leasing plans is it's not just good for the public, it's actually good for industry too, because in some ways they will, it's all much more upfront, there's much more of a engaged process from both sides, and then they have more certainty. If you're industry, once you get a lease after a master leasing plan has been done, you know that it's not going to be one of these shouldn't be one of these drawn out fights like that I'm talking about here. And so they're using these, and there's been a couple of them done, and there's a bunch under development of these master leasing plans. So, I mean, yeah, that's my answer, I guess, is things have gotten somewhat better, and it's important to kind of rely on conservation groups that are watchdogging and who are the ones, I think, to engage the public in that process.
I've been around this for a long time. I lived in Alaska when they did the original leases to go out and explore at Prudhoe Bay. And so I know what you're talking about, but Garfield County specifically has two specific county commissioners that are real pro-oil. And you can have all the safeguards and we have all these regulations. The oil companies are just fine because they have all these regulations. Last summer, the BLM and the EPA were forced to admit that 4 out of 10 wells drilled in Colorado and 6 other states had never been inspected. And it's a little hard to trust. And how do we know that? You're right, the Obama administration made a really good effort, but who's watchguarding it? How do you find out who these watchdog people are? How do you find out when a lease is going to come up? If it wasn't for a college kid in Utah,
Right.
There would be oil drilling right now in Arches and Canyonlands. And how do you find out about these things in enough time to get some momentum going? I mean, it's like they've always been very underhanded.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't know. I'm not sure the question, but it's like I won't argue with any of that. They do legally have to, when they're going to lease, I mean, to answer that part of the question, they have to, 60 days? They have to post it in a local paper, publish it in the Federal Register. There's something else they have to do. There's the quarterly lease sale thing that comes out. Obviously, most of the public doesn't track any of that stuff. Again, that's where I think conservation... Yeah, but conservation groups do follow that stuff. Like, I think it'd be hard for some of these places to think, okay, a new lease sale's coming and somehow sportsman conservation groups for those areas are going to miss it. you know, it's funny, I think we did back then, like some of these ones I'm talking about from the 80s and 90s, I think we were, no one, oil and gas, I mean, the technology was, you know, it was leasing, it's just a paper thing. They never end up drilling, right? And so no one took it that seriously back then. Well, technology changed, and all of a sudden they're really drilling. And so then you're like, oh my gosh, the leasing is the key stage here. We got to be tracking this. So we've gotten much better about tracking it. That doesn't, I mean, the rest of everything you said, I agree with. And
I was really interested in the parallel between the broad coalition of diverse stakeholders that don't normally talk together and what we're facing here with Thompson Divide. Very similar kind of thing. So there are these urgent issues that bring together all these different kind of people, and at the same time, other urgent issues that don't have that same capacity to bring people together, also related to wilderness.
yep,
Thinking, for example, wolves.
right.
You talk to the same groups about wolf reintroduction at that same time, and you're going to see the opposite. You're going to see oil
Yep.
and water. So can you
that's
give us some advice about how to prioritize and how to maintain the right conversation without alienating certain groups?
It's a great question. I wish well, on the wolf issue, I certainly don't have the answer, because I can tell you, like, for that coalition that formed on the Rocky Mountain Front, the Coalition to Protect the Rocky Mountain Front, boy, that was an issue we just could not talk about, wolves. You know, that was a very hot button issue, as you can imagine, in Montana with when they were reintroduced, and then we went through, you know, delisting and all of that. And there were lots of, a lot of ranchers were involved in the coalition for the front, and a lot of them lost livestock to wolves and things like that. And so, I guess one lesson learned was, I think I said it earlier, is about, well, let's just keep going back to the one thing we can all agree on. Like, we would be in meetings, and you could see us kind of getting off and people's kind of triggers getting, things. And it was like, you just needed to have someone good from a facilitation and leadership standpoint, kind of just make sure the group comes back to the one common kind of nugget that brought them all together. That was key, because otherwise you run a lot of risk of kind of getting to these things and it blowing everything up. I think the other thing was, just having an openness to walk in the other shoes and learn things. So, I mean, I'd never participated in, brandings or calving. I was up there then helping this rancher just because I wanted, and a couple of them had never been to DC in their life, so I'm taking them around the halls in Congress. And so you build these kinds of trust and, walking in the other shoes, or understanding their views, because you've been in their kind of mindset, if you will, or done some of what they're, how they think about the things. And then, for that, it was interesting for the front example. There was kind of these three phases. So there was this oil and gas phase. That's what was the catalyst that brought people together, like I described. Then there was actually this phase about travel planning, where the Forest Service was going through the process of developing their travel plan, which is kind of a document that says what areas are going to be open or closed to snowmobiles or ATVs or all different forms of recreational use. And what was interesting on that, and they're often, I'm sure it's true here, they're often very contentious, right? But again, in this case, the ranchers in that coalition really weren't that keen about ATVs, motorcycle users. They saw them as leaving gates open, scaring cattle, and so we were able to kind of re-solidify our common agreement on something there. And then it eventually went to that third stage, which was fascinating around, because normally you could never get them to be in support of something around wilderness, right? But again, as I described that Rocky Mountain Front Heritage Act, it had this third provision in it about noxious weeds, which, so I would argue that I have seen in a bunch of places in Montana and Wyoming. Weeds is something that can bring everyone together. There's no one out there who's going to say, no, I want weeds. You may have fights about, chemicals and things like that. You can get those sometimes, but about the idea about education and weed pulls and having more, sharing of planning and resources around weed efforts, that can bring everyone together. And it certainly played out here. So yeah, I think but I have not seen it happen. All those things I described on something like wolves. I don't know how you do it. Or some of these, I actually think some of these wildlife issues are the toughest ones. And I haven't. It's really hard to see how. I haven't seen much of where those have broken through and built those broad coalitions around, bison management or wolves or whatever. So.
We'll take one more question and then.
Well, this technically isn't a question, but first I want to say, I think you're so right to walk in other people's shoes. And to the woman who disagrees with the Garfield County Commissioners, so much of this county's money that keeps it running has come from the oil and gas, and to balance it on the backs of people, at our end of the county, it doesn't matter quite as much. At the lower end of the county, it does. And I just feel that, I wouldn't want to let that pass.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Well, thanks everybody so much. I'm sure Peter will stick around if folks have a couple more questions, but hopefully we'll see you next week for the screening of Damnation. Have a good night.